But now we're talking about some serious stuff. So before we get into how that could disrupt voting, let's look at hacking the election. It's ominous, but we'll see if it's a real threat. First slide up here, we're going to be looking at the national electoral voting in 2012. Now you see the larger part of this chart, this nice little amber orangey color, represents the paper ballot with the optical scan. That's the sort of fill in the bubble, take it to the machine voting that many of us in New York are familiar with. Now votes without a paper backing system are prone to security and reliability flaws, but fully 20% of voters will not use a paper-backed system. It's not a problem we have to worry about here in New York, but you can see the other numbers, the other colors represented there. This blue portion of the graph represents the electric voting machines, and the others, these hand-counted votes that make up this little sliver, that's like the old system we saw in Florida, maybe with the hanging chads poking their way through. Think of that. And then this very slim margin of other voting methods. Think these straw polls and the caucuses that happen in those far-flung exotic places like Iowa that we heard so much about during the caucus season. But moving on to our next slide here, we're going to see paper backing across the United States. Now, many voters from battleground states such as Pennsylvania and Virginia, look how good we are. We even labeled it so you don't have to be good at geography. You can say PA and VA have states with touchscreen machines, but no laws requiring the voter-verified paper audit trails. You see this little star here represented in New York City. That is a state that does use voter-verified paper audits as official election records, just in case of a recount. So we got your stuff in a box in case we need to refer back to it if there's a question along the way. But looking at the map there, you can see that there's a lot of variations. The southern and these panhandle states are going the way with the scans, but Illinois, Ohio, very important state coming up in this election, and New York all have that sort of two-step verification. And according to this map, New York does use those paper audit trails once again. So that may be good news for the two gentlemen who are in the studio with me now. So we're going to make sure that you know who they are in the A block. All right, so with the rapid growth of electronic voting, could your vote end up in the wrong column? Thanks to someone somewhere with software savvy? Well, here to talk about what New York City has done and is doing to avoid this potential danger to our democratic process is Michael Ryan. He's the executive director of the New York City Board of Elections. Welcome to BK Live, sir.
Very nice to be here.
Glad to have you.
Thank you for having me.
And also joining us is Alexander Urbelis, an attorney with the Blackstone Law Group and an expert in information security. Thanks for joining us, Counselor.
Excellent to be here. Thank you very much.
So from the outset, I should, I guess, let you guys know a little behind-the-scenes stuff. We called dozens of people, and not a lot of folks want to come on and be on the record and talk about voting security, especially as it pertains to the way that electronic voting has really taken off and has the ability to change our democratic process. So why, from the brave two who are here, do you think there's so much trepidation about that?
Well, I think from my perspective, and I can only speak for myself, we want to get the word out there that the voting system, not only in New York City, but in New York State, is safe. And people should come out to vote, exercise their democratic guaranteed rights, and don't let those folks looking to do things for nefarious purposes win. We all win when people come out to the voting process.
So what's at stake here? Why is there so much, not really, I'll talk to you, but I don't want to be your face.
I think there's another explanation as well. So the people that are doing the security research on these particular issues, they may be working for the independent testing authorities that accredit the voting mechanisms themselves. One of the major issues that Politico had reported on last month was that some of these testing authorities actually receive funding from the manufacturers themselves. Then the testing authorities are buttoned up through very tightly worded and stringent non-disclosure agreements. And these NDAs then would apply to the subcontractors. The really interesting people, the guys that come from a hacker background, that generally have a mindset of transparency and accountability and openness when it comes to the voting process.
Think the anonymous folks.
Think the anonymous folks, exactly. They then find themselves in a corporate environment where they may be buttoned up, and they have to choose between essentially becoming what would amount to a whistleblower or keep their livelihood. That's a very difficult position to take. And if they want to come on the record and do it within the confines of their employment agreements and their NDAs, they need the approval of their employers. That becomes very problematic for the employers because they don't want to jeopardize their contracts with the independent testing authorities. So it's a mechanism, I think, that involves a lot of different complicated corporate structures, but I think is easily explainable. It's also really important to have this particular public debate, and it's unfortunate that people are so unwilling to come out on the record. And I don't disagree with what Mike has said here. I think New York, it's extremely important for people to go out to the ballots. I voted 2 weeks ago in the primaries. I used the optical scan mechanism, and I was so pleased that it worked. It worked very, very well. It's not to say that there aren't some issues that I have with the entire ecosystem.
So let's bring it from that 10,000 feet view back down to even like the local Brooklyn level when folks are going in. Do we have a decentralized system? Because this is like this jargon that, you know, the more central the system is, if someone finds some little wormhole in, they can do a whole lot of damage.
Correct. So I think we have to take it backwards a little bit and go to how did we end up with an electronic voting system. It really goes back to Bush v. Gore, when there were numerous disparate systems throughout the country, and the Congress acted and said, no, we're all going to transition to a more modern voting system. New York State was literally the last state in the country to get on board with that.
I remember that sound when you had to...
Exactly. First of all, I mean, the old lever machines are like an old sweater. They may not look pretty, but they're very comfortable, and people like them. But the new systems were mandated by Congress to put in place. The big debate in Albany, which I think was ultimately the right debate, was they wanted to have a paper backup. And not only have a paper backup, but our voting systems are not permitted to be networked one to the other. So each one of those over 5,000 machines that we deployed to 1,200 poll sites throughout the city are standalone units.
So think of it like the Christmas lights. It's not like the old string where if you get in one, the whole thing goes out. So if one is corrupted, it's just that one dim bulb and the others are still shining bright. That's how we can look at each of our polling places.
And you would need physical access to all of those 5,000 machines at 1,200 sites virtually simultaneously or somehow go unnoticed throughout the entire voting day in order to intentionally corrupt those machines. Now, they do have flash drives in them. The flash drives can malfunction, and that's why we also have the paper system.
So is the bigger threat, talking to like the cyber security, is the threat the guy who's going to come in and like do the switcheroo with the thumbnail, or is it the Russians who are over across the sea somewhere pressing buttons and not the guy from down the block who has the magic thumb drive? You know,
it's hard to say, really. I think we should never underestimate the capabilities of an aggressive adversary, especially a nation state with near unlimited funding. These things happen. We saw what happened with the DNC in Russia very recently. I still have my own questions about whether the attribution for that was entirely accurate. I'd like that to be a little bit more transparent. James Clapper made some statements about this yesterday. And this is voting is a fundamental tenet of our democracy, as Mike had mentioned before. And public confidence in that system is critical to encourage people to come out to the polls. And I can back up what Mike had said, which is that the paper backup is the way to go. Some of these systems that have digital voting with no paper audit trail are totally insane. Completely, it's just mind-blowingly ludicrous. That these still exist in some places. A lot of these machines are running old versions of Windows that haven't been patched. You can tamper with them when you're in the voting booth itself. The paper system at least gives you something to check you have a record of it. That's the absolute best way to go in the system, aside from just going with a straight paper system. The problem with the paper system, though, is that any system is going to have security vulnerabilities. I don't mean to poke holes specifically in New York, but any system is going to be subject to it if you don't have the proper audits. So with the paper system, my issue with it is it's great to have in case of a backup, but how do we know? How do we detect that anomaly? If it's a minute anomaly that can tip an election in one favor slightly,
which
how
looks
is that
like where we may be going with the presidential? If there are razor-thin margins, what is the mechanism to activate to say, all right, let's go back and check those paper ballots? Like, how close does it have to be, or how much protest would one side have to make?
Well, first, we have an automatic audit process. We call it the 3% audit. That is a random 3% of all the machines in the city get tested at every election. And then that progressively goes up if there is any anomalies. But in addition to that, the Board of Commissioners in the City of New York have stated if the margin of victory in any contest for public office is within 1/2%, then that triggers.
That's pretty damn close.
Well, it is close, but when you think of 1/2% of 2.2, 2.3 million voters, it's still a large number, especially in a presidential. But if it is within that range, that automatically triggers a full-on, paper recanvass.
So let's go one step back from there into the registration process. When we've heard a lot of states make a lot of noise about these protections and voter IDs and what seemingly is a not very statistically important voter fraud, but what about registering and doing all of these electronically?
Okay, so even though we have a form of electronic registration, we primarily get those records from the Department of Motor Vehicles. There is no direct interface between the New York City Board of Elections and the Department of Motor Vehicles. What happens is that those records come in, they get parked in a queue, and those queues get manually worked by a bipartisan team. If a Republican does the initial check of the record, then the Democrat signs off on it, and vice versa. And in addition to that, we also have our traditional paper registrations that we get in, and that still is the overwhelming majority of the records that we get is the actual paper records, which we have to keep the hard copy for 2 years, and then we can only dispose of the hard copy if we can verify that we have a scanned electronic, basically a PDF of the original record.
So in that spirit of that same nonpartisan checking and double checking, the way that you keep it all even, I want to ask you, if you have a candidate out there at any level of running for an election for whatever office who's already talking about a system being rigged and how things could shake down in the end, does that make your job harder or easier going in the next day with people saying, oh, the system is rigged?
Well, I will say this. Anytime extra attention is being paid to any agency, whether it's the Board of Elections or any other governmental agency, certainly that adds an element of complication. But within that element of complication, it also provides an opportunity to discuss these issues, get more accurate information out to the public, because quite frankly, when we don't have an election, nobody's really interested in talking to Mike Ryan or anybody else from the Board of Elections. The only time we get primetime coverage is when an election is going on, and understandably so. So this is our season. I'm happy to come out and reassure the voters that the actual results are safe and secure. And we are taking other steps, which we won't discuss details on clearly, to make sure that even the unofficial results that we publish on election night are impervious to penetration.
All right, let's go to that election night now. I know there's a very distinct sort of evidentiary chain. What do we call this when you get the vote and then you get the results? And there is the potential, since these things are disseminated electronically, for someone to introduce an element of doubt. If there's a Russian hacker or some bad actor, we've got the results, it's all tabulated, and in between your office and us reporting, it's this person won and not that person, and then you guys have to come back and clean that up.
Yes.
That can really undo the republic.
Yeah, and I think it frankly goes back to a really important point that Mike just mentioned, which is that unless it's an election year and possibly a presidential election year, people aren't really interested in talking to the director of Board of Elections or talking about elections at all.
Right.
What we need a little bit more transparency and accountability, especially with the optical voting mechanisms, because they work in an unnetworked capacity, are what is the potential that these systems can be compromised before the election night? What's the security around these particular systems that are going to be tallying the digital ballots themselves? We want to call them a digital ballot box. If we can imagine, a police officer in the olden days when we had the mechanism, the hand poll, taking a box of ballots and walking it over there, you're doing that same thing. It's the functional equivalent, but with a USB drive, and you're plugging that into a system. And if that system is going to be compromised, it's not going to happen on election night. It's going to happen a year before election night, or 6 months, or 3 weeks, or 2 weeks. But more likely, it will happen way before. And what is the accountability? What are the security auditing mechanisms for those people? Do we do background checks on them? Who has access to those particular systems? And what about these particular machines in which you're plugging into a USB? It's more difficult, of course, if they're in an unnetworked capacity, if there's an air gap between those machines and the internet. But if you look at sophisticated nation-state attacks, something like Stuxnet, if you've ever heard of Stuxnet, this was a very sophisticated attack on the Iranian nuclear centrifuge system, a system that was compromised still with an air gap. And there was a very pernicious virus that was named Stuxnet that propagated itself from USB drive to USB drive to USB drive until ultimately it contaminated a USB drive that was plugged into the machine that controlled the nuclear centrifuges in Iran. It overrode the safety mechanisms and caused them to spin at an unsafe speed, breaking the centrifuges and setting back Iran's nuclear capabilities probably several years. So these kinds of attacks do happen. They can happen. And that's why I think we need a little bit more security understanding of those particular systems when it's not under the national spotlight. Perhaps this is an argument for Mike to get more funding.
Well, this is where I'm going. $35 billion over the next 5 years is going to Cyber Command once they spin off from the NSA. If that actually happens, how would you like to see some of that shake down to making sure that we do have the security and the lock and key is extra tight during those off seasons when we're not focused on getting you in the seat every week?
Well, I think that all of that is happening dynamically. We would certainly like to, and I'm certain that we will, like to work very closely with the New York State Board of Elections to, quote unquote, get our piece of the cybersecurity pie if funding is being made available. But in terms of the machine setup, there are two thumbnail, flash drives, whatever you want to call them, in each machine. We recycle those over and over, so they get overwritten. We do that under the umbrella of the watchful eye of the vendors that we work with, as well as the public sends watchers to our warehouses. We send out letters to all of the chairs of each party, and they can send public watchers to watch as the machines are being set up. So there is a level of transparency, although it doesn't get a lot of attention because it's kind of happening while everybody else is going about their business.
Yeah. So as we wrap up now, I'm going to ask you to give me a reason to feel secure in my vote this November, and you play the cynic and give me something to look for, something that we can do better.
Well, I think the reason to feel secure is some of the things that we already discussed. I mean, the state legislature was reticent to transition from the lever machines to a wide open electronic system without paper backup. The paper backup is the ultimate security of the system. If there's any indication that there was some type of foul play, we would have to revert to the paper, and the paper is almost impossible to tamper with if you're looking to change the results of an election. You might be able to tamper with an individual ballot, but when you have over 2 million people voting in a presidential election, to do that enough
We all saw Carrie. It's not
right.
like the prom
Correct.
queen thing.
Exactly
where
right. So I mean, to do that enough to shift
Yeah.
the dynamic of the election is extremely difficult, if not impossible.
All right, conspiracy theory. Give me a reason.
Well, again, I think that the paper ballots are absolutely critical to the system. What I question, however, though, is even with a 3% audit of the vote, whether or not we would know if there was tampering involved, because we are all proceeding under the assumption that this peculiarity or some kind of malicious actor would be acknowledged or would be noticeable in some kind of result. And I think if we are looking at actors who have been active for several years, possibly in our systems or our networks, or in the vendors themselves. If those watchful eyes themselves have been compromised and they operate generally in an opaque fashion, then how can we trust that accountability process when the vendors themselves are opaque? There's the issue, I think, really, to hit it on the head, is that I think we need a little bit more transparency. And this is no fault of the Board of Elections. I just think that these corporate entities that run the machines and manufacture the machines and accredit the machines should be a little bit more open. They should share their code. They should share their processes. When they do, I'll have more confidence.
Well, thank you for making New York a hard target, because we saw that map and there's a lot easier places to go mess with an election. So we appreciate that and hope to see you back maybe in June sometime, July, when it's not election time. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.